The journey back to Tenochtitlan felt longer than any Yautl had ever taken. The surviving warriors moved slowly along the road leading back toward the valley, exhausted beyond words after the catastrophe at Battle of Atumba. Armor hung loose against battered bodies. Many carried wounds wrapped hastily with cloth, already stained dark with blood. Others limped in silence, supported by companions equally close to collapse. And at the center of the weary group, resting upon a wooden transport frame carried by two elite eagle warriors, was Tizok. Even in death, Yautl found it difficult to look at him for long. The absence of movement felt wrong, impossible. For as long as Yautl could remember, his father had always seemed immovable, strong, certain, larger than the men around him. Now he lay wrapped carefully beneath woven cloth, his ceremonial armor cleaned as best the warriors could manage during the march home. No words passed between the men carrying him. The silence itself was respect. By the time they reached Yautl's home, the afternoon sun had already begun lowering behind the distant mountains. The city itself felt changed, not defeated, not yet, but wounded. Yautl stopped outside his cottage and stood motionless for several moments before finally stepping toward the door. His hand hesitated briefly, then knocked. Inside, he heard voices. A moment later, the door opened. Guadalupe appeared first, immediately sensing something was wrong before her eyes even reached the frame behind him. Beside her stood little Cacamatzin, still too young to fully understand battle, death, and loss. Yautl swallowed hard. "Come outside," he said quietly. The tone alone told Guadalupe enough. Her expression changed instantly. Without another word, she stepped forward slowly. Then she saw the frame, saw the still body resting upon it. Her hand immediately rose to her mouth. The sound that escaped her was small, broken. Yautl knelt beside his son and gently took the boy's hand in his own. Cacamatzin looked between the adults uncertainly, confusion clouding his young face. Yautl steadied himself before speaking. "Your grandfather lived, and he died a hero, Cacamatzin," he said softly. His voice nearly failed him halfway through. "He died in the service of the Aztec Empire." Guadalupe began weeping quietly beside them. Yautl looked down at his son, trying desperately to remain composed for him, but grief pressed heavily against every word. Only minutes later, the sound of approaching soldiers echoed down the road. Yautl rose immediately. Instinct overtook grief. A large band of warriors approached the home in disciplined formation, torches flickering beside them as dusk deepened across the city. At their center walked Cuitlahuac. The new emperor had changed visibly since taking power after the death of his brother Montezuma. The uncertainty surrounding the empire had hardened him quickly. His movements carried urgency now. His expression remained constantly burdened by decisions larger than any one man. The moment Yautl recognized him, he straightened immediately to attention and instinctively guided Cacamatzin to do the same. The child tried awkwardly to imitate his father's posture. Cuitlahuac noticed. "Yautl," the emperor said as he approached, "I apologize for coming to your home under these circumstances." His tone carried genuine respect. "I must return to the palace shortly, so I will be brief." He paused, looking first toward Guadalupe, then down toward Cacamatzin before continuing. "Tizok was an important captain in the Aztec army," he said, "and he meant a great deal to all of us." His eyes shifted toward the covered body. "It is with that respect that I ask your permission to have his funeral given with state honors." Yautl remained perfectly still. "Tomorrow," Cuitlahuac continued, "we will cremate my brother Montezuma." A brief silence followed. and I ask that your father be put to rest with him." For a moment, Yautl could not speak. The weight of the gesture struck him deeply, not because it erased his grief, nothing could, but because it acknowledged what Tizoc had been, not merely to his family, but to the empire itself. Finally, Yautl lowered his head respectfully. "My emperor," he said quietly, "by this gesture you honor my father and our family." He inhaled slowly. "And I humbly accept your offer." Cuitlahuac looked directly at him. "He has honored himself," he replied. The words hit Yautl harder than he expected. For an instant, his mind returned years earlier to the battle with Tlaxcala, when Tizoc had spoken those exact same words to him after a display of courage in battle. He had honored himself. Cuitlahuac turned towards several waiting warriors. "Carefully," he instructed. The soldiers moved forward respectfully and lifted Tizoc's body from the transport frame. Yautl watched silently as they carried his father away toward the palace for the final time. The following day, mourning spread throughout the city. The funerary ceremonies for both Montezuma and Tizoc and several other nobles and prominent warriors were conducted with solemn reverence beneath heavy skies. Smoke rose into the air as prayers echoed through temple grounds already burdened by months of war and uncertainty. Citizens gathered in large numbers despite exhaustion and fear. Warriors stood silently while priests recited ancient rites intended to guide the dead onward into the next world. Yautl stood beside Guadalupe throughout it all, saying little, feeling even less capable of speech. But once the ceremonies ended, the city changed again. Mourning gave way to urgency. Inside the palace walls, Cuitlahuac addressed his advisors bluntly. "We must prepare for Cortez's return." No one disagreed. "All preparations must be made to defend Tenochtitlan when they do." And so the work began immediately. Throughout the summer of 1520, the city transformed itself for war. Every able-bodied man worked. Warriors drilled daily. Causeways damaged during the Spanish retreat were repaired and reinforced. New defensive outposts rose throughout the city, especially along the main access routes leading toward the island capital. Canals were monitored carefully, weapons crafted continuously. Yautl buried himself in the labor. It gave structure to grief, a purpose stronger than memory. Each day he trained warriors, supervised fortifications, and prepared for the inevitable return of Cortez and the Spaniards, now recovering in Tlaxcala. And then, in October of 1520, something far worse invaded the Aztec Empire. At first, it seemed isolated, a sickness, unfamiliar, strange. Then it spread, quickly, relentlessly. The smallpox outbreak that swept through Tenochtitlan became one of the most catastrophic events in the history of Mesoamerica. Introduced unknowingly by Spaniards arriving from Cuba, the disease found a population with no immunity whatsoever. The results were devastating. People developed fevers first, then eruptions across the skin. Pain followed, blindness in some, death in many. Entire households became bedridden simultaneously. Families died together because no one remained healthy enough to care for the sick. The city's streets filled with corpses waiting for burial or cremation. The stench of decay spread across districts already strained by war. Some chronicles would later call it the Great Leprosy. Others simply described it as the end of the world. For nearly 2 months, the disease consumed Tenochtitlan completely. Death rates climbed beyond comprehension. Perhaps half the population. Perhaps more. On December 4th, 1520, even Cuitlahuac succumbed to the disease. The emperor, who had united resistance against the Spaniards, ruled only briefly before smallpox took his life. Leadership fractured again, and still the sickness spread. For Guadalupe and Yautl, the disease became deeply personal. Guadalupe fell ill first. The fever struck violently, confining her to bed for weeks. Her strength disappeared almost overnight. At times, she became so weak she could barely speak. And she was pregnant, in her 3rd trimester. Yautl tried desperately to care for her while continuing his duties within the city, but the disease gave little mercy. Eventually, the strain upon her body became too much. The child was lost, stillborn. Guadalupe wept for days afterward, even when too weak to sit upright. Then Yautl himself became infected. Soon after, little Cacamatzin showed symptoms too. For nearly a month, Yautl battled the disease through fever and exhaustion. His body survived, though barely. But Cacamatzin worsened rapidly. His young body simply could not withstand the assault on his still developing immune system. By mid-December, just as the city itself slowly began emerging from the worst of the outbreak, Cacamatzin died of smallpox pandemic. The grief that followed hollowed the house completely. Yautl buried both children himself behind their property, beneath a tree overlooking the nearby stream. The ground was cold when he dug the graves. Guadalupe stood nearby, wrapped tightly in blankets, still physically weakened but unwilling to remain inside. Neither spoke much during the burial. There were no words large enough for what had been lost. Afterward, silence became common between them. Not hostile, not openly bitter, just wounded. Yautl returned to military duties once he recovered physically, often working from dawn until late evening, preparing defenses for the war everyone knew would return. And when he came home, he felt it. The distance, the unspoken accusation. Guadalupe never directly blamed him for the deaths of their children, but she did not need to. He remembered her warning clearly now. We should leave Tenochtitlan. And somewhere inside her grief, part of her believed they might still be alive had he listened. Deep down, Yautl feared she was right.